Hi, welcome back to Normalize the Conversation. Today I'm here with Dr. Michelle Chung. Dr. Michelle Chung is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in anxiety-related ADHD/executive functioning challenges, building resiliency, and in working with recovering perfectionist type. Currently, Dr. Chung heads a boutique group practice in New York City and teaches at Mount Sinai Medical Center. Dr. Chung, thank you so much for joining me today. I am so excited for our conversation. How are you really?
Well, first, thanks so much for being here. It's really an honor, and I love whenever we get to have a conversation together.
You too.
So thanks so much. How am I really? Such a good question. I would say just given everything that's happening around us and, with the pandemic, everything that's happening in Ukraine, there's just so much. I would say I'm really trying to make a decision to stay positive, to make positive choices, and just really being able to ride that wave of uncertainty. I've been saying to so many of my clients, it's all about the pivot.
Yes. That reminds me of Friends, Ross. Pivot,
Yes.
pivot.
Uh-huh.
One of my favorite scenes. But you know what? It is so true. We've been living in so much uncertainty for the last 2 years now. And as much as I want to say that it's easy to get used to it now because it's been that way, it's still very overwhelming. And there is so much happening constantly. Once you think we've seen it all, something else happens. And it
Absolutely.
really is hard to stay positive in the midst of it, especially when you turn on your TV or open your social media and you're seeing the news and it's all the bad things happening.
Right.
So I'm really excited that really happy that you're trying to stay positive and work through it. Today, I actually started bullet journaling with my brother's girlfriend because we were like, how can we stay positive? How can we do something that sparks our creativity and inspires us in the midst of a time where it's just so dark and depressing?
And so hard. Fran, I love that idea. Not only do I love the idea of bullet journaling, but doing it together with somebody, I feel it just makes it that much more, obviously it keeps you accountable to keeping it up, but also that much more kind of, it builds that connection with another person. So
Exactly. And we can build off each other. So I was like, we should do a gratitude page. And she's like, and let's add affirmations. So it's really being able to kind of balance each other out and encourage each other to do more, which I really like. And it helps us to want to continue to do it because that's a fun activity when we spend time together. So it's the first thing we'll do before we go do something that we might find more exciting.
oh, I love that. I think you've just inspired me to try to do this as a family with with my family
Right.
members.
I think it's so fun. But first of all, I want to say that I am just absolutely amazed by you. You know how much I adore you. You have such a
You.
range of amazing specialties: anxiety, ADHD, executive functioning, affect regulation, perfectionism. What inspired all of this passion to become a clinical psychologist?
Well, Fran, first of all, you're just too kind. um,
The truth.
I will say this, it's been a long road. I think I really will say that I am in a, somewhat of a lucky and unique position where I can say, I really love what I do. I, for the most part, get up every morning. I look forward to seeing my clients and getting either on video or to my office and doing, what I do really does bring me joy. Of course, there are those moments where I would love to be able to stay in bed for a few more minutes or whatever it might be. But I love being able to every day see what my day holds. You in some ways don't never know, but it's an exciting type of never know. And at the same time, I feel like I learn something new from my clients every day, and I'm inspired by their ability to be vulnerable and brave, and just lots of wisdom I even gain from them as well. So I think if I were to think back to when it all started, I would say for me, it probably started when I was definitely a little kid. In my social group, I was that kid that everyone used to come to talk about problems, just tell me things. And I remember when I was in sixth grade, I walked up to my mom and I said, Mom, I want to be a psychologist. And it's a weird thing to say when you're in sixth grade.
You were so young.
I was I was very young. And since then, that was my path, right? I always had a curiosity for human nature. I always wanted to understand what was underneath people's motivations, what was really behind what people were saying. And my husband jokingly says to me all the time that my favorite question is why. I'm always asking the why of what people are doing or why people are saying certain things. So I think there was an innate curiosity and just that has grown in me over time. And I went to college with that intention. I was going to be a psychology major. I wanted to go to a clinical psychology doctoral program. And around my junior year, I want to say I hit a bump in the road, and I might say I burnt out pretty early at that point. I worked really hard and was doing all this research where I was getting undergraduate grants, and instead of being a slow burning flame, I want to say I was sort of a firecracker and burnt out really quickly. So upon graduation, I decided to take a job in management consulting and wanted to try out the business world, just wanted to try a different part of my brain. And I will say, I do not ever regret that decision. It helped me understand things from a totally different perspective. I got a lot of different experiences and life lessons that I learned during that time. But it came to a point where I knew this was not my passion. And I had to go back to what I felt. In terms of finding like purpose or a meaning, I felt like psychology was really more aligned with my values and what really meant, really had meaning for me. So I went back into research and publications and finally applied to graduate school. And here I am.
That is such an amazing story to know what you wanted to do so young and to kind of stray off that path and then come full circle back to it is amazing. And thank you for being so brave and open with that, because it's such a common story, right? That we have this goal in mind and we work so hard towards it and we burn out. And then on top of that, it's such a common story that we have this intention of what we want to do. And then we go to college and it changes and we kind of take the safe job. Mm-hmm. And then we sometimes start to regret it. We're like, why didn't I go for this? Or this isn't my passion. This isn't what I want to do. I don't want to be at this job every day. And not enough people get the chance or have that ability to get to change majors, go back, get that degree that they want. A lot of people, whether it's the lack of resources to be able to, the lack of time, or if it's just this fear, a lot of people aren't able to take that step. So I hope you celebrate the fact that you take that step. But for those listening who maybe can relate to this, where they're feeling burnt out or they're not loving the career path they chose, what advice do you have for them?
That is such a great question. When I talk to my young adults about this, a lot of times what I always stress to them is that this, especially finding your sort of greater purpose or your career, hopefully, you will be in that position where they can actually intertwine. It really is a journey, right? And that at any point, I think there's a lot of fear about making that wrong decision. And when you're making those decisions, it feels like it's such a big deal, right? Every decision you make, every path that you decide to pursue feels like that's almost like a final destination. But I always remind my clients, hey, we're going to go back to this, the pivot, right? There's always moments where you can pivot. And there's always moments to, I think there is value in exploring different opportunities and just different strengths that you might have. And then if it doesn't work out, there's a pivot.
Yes, that is so true. And going back to what you said before, it's just such a hard time to make that change. People are afraid because there's so much fear and pressure on every decision we make, especially as young adults, because you're in high school and you have to pick what college you want to based on what job you want, what degree you want, because you want to be in the best program for what you want. And then you have to excel in that. And then you have to know what grad school program you want or what job you want. And if you make the wrong decision, that's it. They put so much pressure and emphasis on knowing what you want and doing the right thing that people are terrified. I know for me, I felt so lost. I was very similar to you in the fact that when I was 12 years old, I knew what I wanted to do. I was going to start a blog called Inspiring My Generation. That
Wow.
was 11 years ago. And now Inspiring My Generation is a nonprofit, and I'm where I am today. But before that, I have a master's in information systems. And my father hates when I say this because it makes him feel like a waste of money. But that wasn't my passion. That wasn't what I want to do now looking back at it.
Right.
But that seemed like the right choice because everyone said technology is the future. You should get into technology. You should learn how to code. And although it's such a valuable skill, and I'm so lucky to be able to have that skill and to have had the ability to go get that degree, whereas many people couldn't, it still wasn't the right path for me. And I'm lucky to be in a position where I can try again and find that right path. But again, there was all that pressure, and I chose something that aligned with the pressure put on me instead of what my heart was telling me.
And I'm so glad that you decided to take that pivot, right? And to really follow your heart and where you felt your purpose, that purpose was really calling you. You know, I actually didn't realize that you this idea came to you at 12. I mean, that's such a young age to really, I mean, even to be able to think in that way at 12. But then to really sort of chase that journey, but then taking these different paths along the way.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's even, it reminds me of even just like holistic brain development. I'm sure it really helped certain parts of your brain, sort of flex itself and develop in a way that it's right now coming all together, right?
Exactly.
Well, that's great.
Thank you. It's so funny. The other day, I found an email my grandmother had sent me 10 years ago. And at the end of the email, she said, I hope to God one day I'm sitting in a rocking chair reading your books. And to see that 10 years
Wow.
ago, that's what I was talking about. And that's what I want to do. And that's where I am today and what I'm doing, to see that I did stray off that path. And there was a huge chance that I was never going to get to that point. But I was lucky enough to recognize it and to have the opportunity to make that pivot. And people like you who talk about it and who share this experience and the story really helps inspire people like me who sometimes aren't sure what decision to make or make a decision. And they're like, you know what, that's not the right one for me. So thank you so much for, again, sharing this.
Absolutely. And I think, the other point that I was just thinking is like, even if you do burn out, just like I did, because I was so eager and so passionate, I think in the beginning that, there's always still a way back, right? Just because there was that burnout doesn't mean that you can't revisit that in a way that's healthier and more
Yeah.
balanced.
Exactly. And I know we have a really important conversation we want to jump into, but before we do that, can you share maybe one or two tips on how to overcome burnout?
Oh, that's such a great idea. A great question. I mean, there is a book that I really have been into recently. Um, and the name is eluding me right now, but it's something Burnout. And I can get you the reference, but it's actually written by two sisters, Nagalski and I'm forgetting the last names, but they had done all this research and looked at all these studies on not only humans but also animal studies, and trying to look at they brought up this idea of completing the stress cycle. Have you heard about this, Fran?
I have not. What is a stress cycle?
So it's fascinating because they're saying that burnout happens because we have basically all these stress cycles that are happening in our life all at the same time, which really makes sense, right? There's, maybe a health stress cycle that's still spinning, right? A school, career, family, financial stuff. So there's all these stress cycles that are happening and they're spinning all at the same time. What's happening is that we're not necessarily closing the loop, closing the cycles so that we can create less stress cycles. And burnout happens when there's multiple stress cycles that are happening all at the same time that are eating away at our resources. And one of the things that they found out is that there are physiological things that we can do to actually get the stress cycles to close. It's quite amazing. And there are things as simple as hugging somebody for 20 seconds, laughter. There's vigorous exercise, or another, I call it the wiggle up. I have to give my son credit for this because one day we were kind of talking about this and he's like, oh, it's kind of like the wiggle up where you just wiggle your whole entire body and just like shake all the stress and energy out.
I love that.
If you do that, of course, sleeping a lot, connecting with people that you love. These are all science-backed ways to complete those stress cycles and reduce the burnout.
I thank you so much for sharing that. That is such amazing tips. Number one, physical touch can just be so great. I get a little burnt out, a little overwhelmed very, very frequently. And I tend to just run to my parents and I'm like, can I have a hug? All I need right now is a hug. Just hold me. And that helps me so much. And I didn't even realize how that's actually a science-backed thing. And it's not just me being needy, it's something that's genuinely able to help people. And then wiggle it out. I love that. I am such an advocate for dancing it out. Obviously, it's from Grey's Anatomy, but that genuinely just blasting Taylor Swift, that's always my go-to, and dancing around the kitchen, just like singing the music and moving my body is so amazing. So, for people listening, I think you just provided so many useful tips that I think people hear, but they don't realize how it's actually something that helps.
Yes, and I'll get the reference and send it to you, Fran, so you can have the
Perfect.
correct title of the book and the authors. But it's a good one. It's very practical too. So
Perfect. I'll make sure to include that in a post too the week this episode comes out. But I really want to switch over now to our topic because I know you specialize in promoting mental health awareness within the Asian American community.
yeah.
So, according to data collected by the National Latino and Asian American Study, although Asian Americans have a 17.3% overall lifetime rate of any mental health disorder, Asian Americans are actually 3 times less likely to seek mental health services. So, of course, there are financial barriers and the mental health stigma that prevents members of all backgrounds and communities from seeking professional help. Furthermore, we often talk about the disparity in seeking treatment among different genders. However, I don't think we talk enough about the disparity in different cultures. So, can you tell us a little bit about the stigma in the Asian American community?
Absolutely. I think in terms of the stigma, it definitely is a multifaceted and complex a bunch of factors that really come together to make it harder for Asian Americans to really seek out mental health services. So there's cultural factors, there's also historical factors that do play a role here. Culturally, the Asian American cultures, there are many out there, right? But most of them do tend to be collectivistic, right? They're more of a collective culture where one's individual needs is not really put before the larger group's needs. And because of that, there are a lot of expectations and a lot of ways in which, in more Western cultures, it's about learning to advocate for yourself, learning to, figure out what you need in situations, drawing boundaries. In these collective cultures, it's more about, what's better for the greater good? What's better for my family, right? What won't bring shame, to my family? So there's a different set of values, really, and a different set of expectations there. And especially when you, and pressure too, right? And especially when you think about families and just how the family groups work, there is this order. It's called filial piety. There's a deference for your elders, right? You respect them, you speak to them in a certain way. So there is this sense of, you have to meet their expectations. You don't want to disappoint them. You have to live up to a lot of, of what they are expecting from you. And therefore, you don't want to bring shame, right? If, say, for example, you have like a certain flaw, I don't know, say, you might struggle with depression, or maybe there's addiction, right? There's a extra layer of wanting to hide those flaws because you don't want to bring them to the surface. Otherwise, it does bring a sense of, maybe there's something wrong with this, with this family, right? The whole group, you're representing the whole group and not just yourself. And I think on top of that, there's these alternative forms of healing in a lot of the Asian American cultures, or Asian cultures, I would say.
It really sounds like the fear of bringing shame to the family name plays a huge role in not wanting to reach out. And you are so right. Within the individualistic cultures, the culture that I've learned growing up here with, we were more, what can we do for ourselves, right? It is really, what can I do for myself to better myself? And if I don't do well on a test, for example, that's my fault. That's not anything with my family. And I don't feel like I am letting my family down, letting my parents down. I take that personally. And it sounds like in a more collective culture, it's not just that personal shame or fear or failure that we have, but it's also the fear of making our family look that way or disappointing our family.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge role, right? So shame, feelings of shame, of guilt, it's not just about you, it's about protecting the whole family.
Exactly. So what advice might you have for someone who is from a collective culture, who's afraid of bringing shame to the family, but really needs some support and doesn't know what to do?
So I would say this is definitely a tricky balance, because again, it is about values and priorities. And a lot of times these, the values, it is a value to say, I want to protect my family, or I don't want to bring shame upon my family. And at the same time, you do have to balance the fact that, yes, paying attention to our own individual needs is also really important, right? I think I have actually in situations and families that I've worked with like this, I have done a lot of psychoeducation with the parent body, right? And in terms of understanding that, this is not necessarily a shame-based thing, right? That everybody, whether they're talking about it or not, is dealing with some sort of struggles, or, whether it's mental health related or just, financially, or it could be anything, relationships, every family has their own struggles. And this just, might be, and a lot of psychoeducation around the fact that, hey, there's nurture and nature here, right? So taking a look at, okay, what's your child's disposition? Like, does depression or anxiety run in your family? how can we as the parents support this and sort of help a family member. Sometimes it could be even the parents that are suffering in this way, right? How can you help that particular family member get better and heal, but at the same time find a place that feels comfortable for them, right? So much overcoming shame is about sometimes putting it out there. Once it's out there, it doesn't have that power over you anymore.
That is so true. And it sounds like family support is huge in a collective culture, because it's not just about me going to therapy and getting the support I need, but when I'm afraid of the shame bringing to my family name, knowing that my family is there for me and supports me along the process and has the information, resources, and tools they need to be able to do that, it helps just reinforce that it's okay not to be okay. Now, I know you also mentioned that there was a historical context. If you wouldn't mind jumping into that as well.
Sure. I think in terms of, there is, I think, some religious aspects here, right, that have been passed down generation to generation, that many of the religions in the Eastern cultures do tend to prioritize a lot of things like self-control, self-discipline, keeping harmony within the group and balance within the group. So there is, I think, an idea that, hey, if you can't keep this in check, then you're either not trying hard enough or you're not, strong enough to do this, right? And in that way, what is really interesting about Asian Americans in general is that in the immigration process, there has been a really strong connection to religious community groups, ethnic religious community groups, because that is a place where other people like you are gathering, right? And so because of that, there is a very strong connection to religious communities in the Asian American group. And I think that is a part of what also makes it hard for people to seek mental health, because depending on the religious, the outlook on mental health in that religious community, but also there's a leaning on the clergy, right? Whether it's the pastors or the monks or, whoever it might be, they tend to rely on them for healing and not doctors in that same way, right?
That was a really great point you brought up. We actually talked about this in class yesterday, and how one of the reasons we're seeing a rise in people reaching out for therapy and going to therapy is because there's been this shift in, I don't want to say a lack of religious beliefs, but understanding that maybe the priest can't always help you, and maybe waiting for the higher power to help you, when there's a reason we have these tools. And I personally believe in God, so I will use God as my term. But God has provided us the ability to do this research, to bring these tools, whether it's medication or CBT or DBT or just any tool that we have, comes from that higher power, and being able to recognize that it's okay to reach out for help. So I love that you brought that up, because I just learned about this less than 12 hours ago.
That's great. Oh my goodness. That's great that you guys are talking about those cultural components even in your classes. I think it just reminded me of something too, which is the immigrant experience itself, right? And how that shapes seeking out help in general. I think that it just, when you asked me about the historical content, it reminded me of intergenerational trauma, right? And just the whether it's, I'm Korean, so I know I had grandparents that lived through the Korean War, right? So there's that trauma that they kind of carry and bring into the next generation. Then, my parents had immigrated to the United States. There was a trauma even in that, right? The immigration struggle, the story is often about struggle, right? So, there's this intergenerational trauma that is passed down, and it also, it reminds me of people from Jewish cultures too, right? The Holocaust survivors and how they have picked up certain traumatic just values and perspectives and ways that they look at the world, and how that affects other generations beneath, or even people who have gone through the Great Depression. There is an intergenerational trauma that does happen. I think for the Asian American population, not only is there a language barrier, right, to seeking out services and just help in general, but there's also this sense for the first generation, second generation, even third generation Asian Americans, there is this idea that my parents have given up so much, my ancestors have given up so much for my own benefit, for that I'm supposed to live this amazing life. And how could I complain about my anxiety or feeling sad or feeling like I can't do certain things, when if I look at my parents or my ancestors, they've gone through so much more. And so really, in some ways, that minimizes our own struggles and feels like we don't have a place, or that you shouldn't have those particular struggles, when obviously mental health struggles do not discriminate ever, right?
Yes. It almost sounds like you feel like you don't have a right to have human emotions.
Yep.
And a lot of people, I think in general, struggle to just find ways to express their emotions, but to not even feel like it's okay to have them and then to learn to express them and process through them has to be so difficult. Now, you touched on intergenerational trauma. For those who don't know much about it, what are some ways that it may show up or present itself in one's life?
So that's I think the way that I have seen it in a lot of my families that I work with and clients that I work with, sometimes it does show up in a sort of financial sense, where if there was a struggle financially, that even though you might be comfortable and in a place where you don't necessarily have to worry about that, there is this anxiety that still sits there around money and finances. Another thing is around food, right? This idea of like, this is so wasteful, or just resources in general, actually, that, so-and-so wasn't able to have this, this was so hard to get, it would be such a waste to either throw that out or not eat every piece of rice on your plate, all of these type of messages that are passed down. But probably the biggest thing that I see that's really passed down generation to generation is anxiety.
Yes, that is so true. And you brought up such a great point that, sometimes we honestly just feel guilty for having more opportunities than our parents did or our grandparents did. And there's this fear and stress of not being able to accomplish more with the opportunities we've been given.
Absolutely.
And look at how far they've come. I got to live up to that. I have to be able to do that too, which can cause a lot of fear. And then with the added piece of, look at how much my family's done and my family name has come through. How can I let them down? What if I bring shame to them because I can't get as far ahead as they have, and I can't provide as much for my kids and my grandchildren?
There definitely is that added layer of pressure, absolutely, that I see in a lot of the Asian American families that I work with, especially in the children. I live in New York City, where there's a lot of very successful, very educated families that, a very clear-cut example of this is when there are parents that have gone to top Ivy League schools, right? Then the children all of a sudden are, whether the parents even put the pressure on them or not, there is just this innate pressure that if they did it, I have to do it too. Right. And so this pressure of, and some of them did it when they didn't even speak English as their first language, or, whatever it might be. So there's this added pressure and layer to meet those standards and those expectations. And that fear of just really disappointing or failing really does weigh on so many of the Asian American people out there. I wouldn't say I'm generalizing here, but it's definitely something that I have seen a lot in my practice.
I'm really happy that you've shared all this information with us, because there really is this idea, I think, a lot around a lot of other cultures, that there is nothing different between my culture and someone else's culture, right? And we tend to just, the model minority myth, right? And I really think, I love how you have related this kind of in a more generalized area and then explain the added pressure, because I think that's where there's a lot of disconnect and a lot of misinformation out there, is people don't understand the added piece. They see just the piece that they relate to. So like, I'll use myself as an example. When you're talking about the fear of, like, for me, it's my dad being successful in business, and I want to be just as successful, but it's not a pressure, a feeling of shame if I'm not, or my family, making my family look bad. It's more of, I want to live up to that, but it's me. It's not the pressure at all from him, or the idea of the pressure based on my culture. So being able to see that kind of line, that on one side versus extending it, was really, really helpful.
And I think, what is a bit unique to the Asian American experience too, in addition to what you were speaking to, is that the model minority myth is something that is unique to the Asian American people, right? It is a societal pressure, actually, that is then added onto everything else. And the model minority myth is it's got an interesting history. So kind of going back to some of the history here. So it was started in the 1960s, and it really was this idea that Asian Americans were good, almost second-class citizens, right? And some scholars actually really believe that the idea of the model minority myth, was created to work against other minorities by saying, hey, look at this group of minorities over here. They were able to achieve certain things, right? And to pit that against other minorities and say, if they're able to do it, why can't you do it? Right? And it's to maintain that current system where, minorities are never really able to rise above, right? And on top of that, there's that assumption that all Asians are the same, which obviously they're not, right? It's absolutely an unreasonable, and that's why it's an unreasonable level of expectations. Plus, that's why it's a myth, right? It's not true that not every Asian is good at math. Not every Asian is going to go to an Ivy League school. There's just so many of these shoulds that are placed on that Asian model minority myth that, I say to my clients all the time, stop shoulding on yourself, right? Because if you live under the tyranny of the shoulds, it really is a form of oppression, right? And that feeling of never being good enough to live up to this unrealistic standard that society has somehow placed on you, it's hard. And it leads to feelings of inadequacy and self-esteem issues. And this is something that I unfortunately do see a lot of in my practice in working with Asian Americans.
I am really, really happy that you brought this up, because first of all, that stereotype of good in math is a really great example, because I think a lot of people can understand and relate to that, because that's what we learn in school, right? That's what we tell people. So when we have someone who is Asian in our class, and we kind of look to see if they're good at math, right? And those are the comments we make. And aren't you supposed to be good at math? Or let's copy off their paper. And there does add a lot of shame if you're not. If you're not good at math, it's like society's telling me, my culture is telling me this idea that I have to, or the society is telling my culture that I have to be good at this. And now I'm letting my community down. I am making a bad name for my entire community, which is so stressful. It's hard enough to do math. I mean, I loved math and I cried during almost every test. So that is just a really big added pressure, is that model minority myth that we have created. And it really does push people down and make it harder. And I think this is a really good segue into my next question, is what are some of these other key factors that contribute to the rate of mental health conditions in the Asian American community?
Yeah, I think, in terms of key factors, I definitely think the high shame, right, in the proneness to shame linked to that collectivist culture leads to increases in suicide rates. That is a known fact that Asian Americans, or Asians in Asian cultures in general, there does tend to be a higher rate of suicide. And I think that model minority myth obviously adds that extra layer that is unique to the Asian American experience. And, just speaking about the model minority myth, it just reminded me of the fact that, when I work with younger Asian kids, I will share with them that I am an Asian that is not that good at math. It never was my thing. It's just not the way my brain worked. And I have a dad who actually has a master's in mathematics. In fact, he has two of them, right? I mean, apparently it's in my genes somewhere, right? But I don't know, it must be a recessive gene. I don't know. It's not the way that was my strength. And so I will tell, those clients like, hey, I was an Asian that was bad at math and I figured it out, and I did fine. So let's break away from that stereotype. And there are some real great role models of that. Somebody that just comes to mind is David Chang, who's a celebrity chef. I don't know if you know who he is, but he started a chain of restaurants called Momofuku. But he is, he's somebody that has excelled. He's won the James Beard Award. He has these like really amazing restaurants, in like Vegas and New York City and Los Angeles. He's a chef, right? And, I don't know, he might've been good at math, who knows, but, he's breaking the mold, right? So these people who, Chloe Kim, the Winter Olympics just happened, right? Amazing. I mean, she's amazing. But again, breaking the mold. So just really finding examples and ways to kind of push that, I think, is really important. Definitely the vulnerabilities of being a population that our immigration history to the United States hasn't been that long. I mean, yes, we have been here, Asians have been here since, I want to say like I think they were saying the 20s. There has been some records, but a majority of the Asian population, started to really kind of move here, kind of more closer 60s, 70s, 80s. So our history here hasn't really been that long. So there is still this immigrant intergenerational trauma culture that is a part of us. And there's this sense, I think, because Asians do have a different way of approaching healing, right? There's this holistic approach. There's looking at more of like religious and spiritual sort of healing ways. There is a tendency to wait very last minute to seek help, especially mental health. type of help and support in that way. And so it reminds me of these stories that we used to have. I used to work in a psychiatric emergency room, the CPEP it's called. And the CPEP is it's kind of an interesting thing, because we knew if an Asian person came through the emergency room, likely it would be a really serious situation, because there is a tendency for Asian people to wait for till the very last minute, till it's very severe, to actually come out and seek help in that way. So I do think that all of those things together produce vulnerability factors, right? And they contribute to making it that much more difficult for the Asian American community to reach out for help and to get the mental health support that they need.
That makes a lot of sense. And first of all, I didn't know that the Asian community didn't start moving over here to like really the 60s and 70s. Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important fact that does the intergenerational trauma adds to that. But the fact that not as many, it sounds like, were really born in the US and even had a chance to be raised in an individualistic culture that we have. And it might be another generation or two before they have any kind of individualistic culture really added into there, which means this is very likely to continue, that you're less likely to reach out for help. So for people who are listening, who are part of the Asian American community, who again maybe are struggling with their mental health and they don't even notice, what are some of those warning signs that it may be time to look for some kind of support?
This is a really important point to stress here, because I do think that whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression, or even more severe things that might be happening, I think the one thing to really think about is, how is it affecting your functioning, right? Like and struggle in that sense can be relative, right? How much struggle how much effort, how much struggle are you putting into this, just to function at whatever level that you're in? And to really ask yourself about pain. How much pain are you in? How much suffering are you feeling? Yes. And, oh, sorry, go on.
No, I just want to say, like, in class, one thing that my teacher had taught us to ask about is, how is it affecting your school or work life and your social life? And if you don't maybe want to go anymore, suddenly all of a sudden you just don't want to show up anymore, you don't have the same energy you did or the productivity, that's a really big warning sign that most people miss.
Absolutely. And I think the thing that I remind people of is, life doesn't have to be lived this way, right? With this amount of struggle or this amount of pain, that there are things that you can do to make it better, or to help yourself, or resources, or support out there. And that is like one of the things that when people say to me, well, maybe I'm fine, like maybe it's not, maybe I'm just making a big deal out of things, or they're reluctant to seek out help or to take that really important step, that is usually what I will say to them. Like, you do realize that you don't have to live your life this way. And so, I do think sort of looking at yourself and seeing, like, how much is it really affecting your functioning? That's usually the main and the first thing to really view and look at. That being said, Fran, I will say this. I think everyone could have something to work on.
Absolutely.
I don't think it always has to be about pain and suffering. I think if there's something that you want to understand better about yourself, if there are habits that it seems like you just can't change, but it's something that you really want to be able to do, these are all things that actually are reasons to seek out potentially, whether it's mental health services or a coach or a psychologist, these are all ways that you can find this level of support. If there's a relationship that's really difficult, but yet still important to you, that would be another reason to really seek out some support and help. So, I always say that you don't have to wait till it becomes a problem, to really look for this type of support. You could get it on, on the front end where it's actually easier to change things and make these improvements. So it's really about how can you improve your life? In what ways do you want to?
Yes, exactly. I actually recently went back to therapy. It had been a full year, and I was like, you know what? I'm noticing that I do prioritize my work and what I do, but I way over prioritize it to where my friends would be like, let's hang out. And I'll be like, okay, but then I'll show up with my work, right? I'll be like, you know what? We can hang out, but we're going to make encouragement cards. And they're like, like, we don't mind making the cards, of course, but sometimes we want to just hang out and not focus on work. Or I'll show up to dinners with my textbook. I've done that the last 4 family dinners in a row. And I was like, you know what? All this is really important to me. And I'm really happy that I have the ability to prioritize. But this can be such an issue later on if I am ignoring my need to have a social life and to be able to surround myself and be present in the present. So just going to therapy and catching something before it becomes a real problem is key. And I'm just so happy you brought that up because that's something I'm going through right now.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you were able to have that self-awareness and that insight to sort of catch it at that place, because, I think it is about, like I said, how do you want to improve your life, and being able to ask yourself that question too.
Exactly. And I have to give a lot of credit to my parents because they both looked at me and said, you need to go back to therapy. And I was like, I know, you are right. I know. I will find a therapist. And my mom blew up my phone with therapists every single day until I made the call. So although I was a little self-aware, my parents really ensured that I reached out. So I do have to give credit to them in case that they're listening and they know I'm not taking complete credit for it. But one other thing I really want to point out, and it's something we've spoken about before, and it's something that I even again talked about in class the other day. It's really cool, by the way, to be in school for psychology and being able to relate these to the conversations.
I know, it's so neat.
It's like, oh, I get that now. But it's really hard sometimes when you go to a therapist and you can't find one that comes from the same cultural background as you. And that's something that's very prevalent in the Asian American community. So if you can't find a therapist who comes from that same culture, are there ways that you can maybe educate your therapist to understand pieces of your culture and your background that may influence your personality and the way you behave and present yourself?
I will say, yes, I think there definitely are. And this is very much, I think, a personal choice, especially since the pandemic and everything that was happening with the AAPI hate movement. I have definitely come across a lot of referrals where people have said to me, I'm in therapy, but I'm in therapy with a non-Asian therapist. And I really feel like it's time for me to work with somebody who is from at least a similar background, and understands some of those values and shares some of those values in that way. That being said, I don't think you need to work with somebody all the time, that is from your similar background, because even people from similar backgrounds might not have the exact same experience, right? But, I'll share a personal experience here that I had. I remember in my early 20s when I was first seeking out therapy, there wasn't many Asian therapists out there, Asian psychologists. And so I really didn't have really anyone to choose from. So I went to a woman who is actually very good at what she does. She came very highly recommended, but was not Asian, and was not Asian. I was speaking to her about a lot of just family dynamics and things that were happening. And, I kept coming across this feeling where she kept pushing me to differentiate from my family, to, sort of separate and become more individualistic in that way. And I was in my early 20s. I, was not ready for that. I wasn't ready for that. And, and I think she, as most majority American cultures, individuation happens right around, when you turn 18, right? They start to kind of say, oh, you're an adult right now. You should start to individuate. But it wasn't aligned with my values, at that point. I was completely high functioning adult. I was in graduate school at that time. I was fine. I had no problems with my family, actually. We were at a good place. And I kept feeling this pull for having to separate. And we spoke about it for a few times here and there, but eventually I just felt like it wasn't a good fit for me. And I eventually left that therapeutic relationship, because it was just a different norm, right? A different cultural standard and norm. I think that being said, I think no matter who you work with, whether it's somebody from your same cultural background or a different, there does have to be some education in terms of where you're coming from, right? Because like I said, even though you're from the same background, it doesn't mean it's exactly the same. But there definitely is something a little bit more, or can be more comfortable about not having to explain certain things in the same way, right? But it very much is an individual choice. But when I think about representation in the industry of mental health, I do think it's really important that there are, Asian therapists out there, and there recently have been more and more of them, which I think is amazing. And, I'll share this quick story. I was recently at an Asian American conference for mental health providers, and they did this really neat exercise at the end where they asked everyone to show your video screens. And there was about probably like 170 some odd of us there. And they asked, if you're practicing 5 years or less, turn off your screen. And I want to say 75% of the screens went blank. And they said, if you've been practicing 10 years or more, turn off your screen. I think there was like 10 of us that were left. Maybe not even. And then they said, if you're practicing 15 years or more, turn off your screen. There was like 5 left. And 20 years or more, there was only 1 person.
Wow, but that just shows how representation is finally growing. And I think that was such an important point to bring up. And I'm so happy you did, because that's a perfect way to finish this off, is the hope that is coming for so many people from the Asian American community. Dr. Chung, you have been absolutely amazing. We are very short on time right now, so I am going to include a clip on our social media page of nonprofits and resources that you have shared with me to be able to put out. So if you're listening to this, please make sure you check our social media for that. I appreciate you, all the amazing work and advocacy you do, and how many people you just inspire, including myself. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Fran, for having me. And I feel the same way just for you, towards you as well.